thank you very much for coming to our Faculty and Alumni Showcase series, where we try to offer the community CLE credits for free, which is sort of nice. And today we have one of our newer faculty members, Melissa Luttrell. She is going to speak about the social cost of carbon. Maybe that's not the most popular subject in Oklahoma, but I think I just looked at did my daily read of the New York Times, and the cover story, at least online, is about how much of how many major cities and countries are going to be submerged if we don't start thinking about the social costs of carbon. Melissa has her JD from Northwestern. She also had some master's level work in environmental law. Before coming to TU, she practiced in sort of environmental and regulatory law. She was also a visiting professor at Florida International University, and she is teaching for us property and environmental law and a class on climate change. So I am very honored to turn it over to my colleague, Melissa Luttrell.
Hello, thank you very much for coming. I realize this is a pretty technical topic that we're going to be talking about. Hopefully you'll find it interesting. There may be pieces that you'll be able to apply to your practice, but hopefully at a minimum, at least as you continue to hear the ongoing debate about this thing, which you've probably heard about, the social cost of carbon, you'll have a little bit of a deeper sense of what's being discussed and what is at stake. So the questions that we're going to look at today are, first of all, what is the social cost of carbon? Why is it that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and oil and coal industry companies are putting so much money into lobbying to reduce the number? And how is this going to affect, if at all, the president's climate agenda, right? So far we're seeing the first steps of that starting to be operationalized. So we'll look at how is the social cost of carbon interacting with that. We can't see how everything's going to play out all the way down the road as every ambitious item on the president's agenda does or doesn't get tackled, but at least we can get a sense from early days on how these two things are interacting with each other as they've both been rolled out recently within the past 12 months. So in order to understand the social cost of carbon, you need to know a little something about how cost-benefit analysis is used in federal rulemaking, because the social cost of carbon numbers that we just got, the updates, the controversial updates that we just got from the federal government on the social cost of carbon are specifically for use in cost-benefit analyses prepared for the federal government. So what is the context they're being used in? What is cost-benefit analysis? Well, it's used in two ways in rulemaking. The first is through OMB regulatory review, which I'm going to go over in some more detail in a minute. And the other is as an independent basis for standard setting. Now, some very few statutes specify that agencies should base their decision on an evaluation of the costs and the benefits, and they imply a cost-benefit analysis standard. That's unusual. Other standards are silent on whether or not cost-benefit analysis can be used to set the standard. And agencies have decided as a matter of policy that they're going to use cost-benefit analysis. After all, they're doing it anyway. So this is a chart, and it doesn't really matter that it's so small you can't read it. I'll tell you what the different steps are, but I just want you to see how complicated this is. And this is one of the least complicated charts on how OIRA works in the rulemaking process. So OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, is an independent, well, I shouldn't say independent, but it's a separate office from the regulatory agencies. And this is the place where the review of agencies' cost-benefit analyses happen. It's done at OIRA, which is within the OMB. So this process requires agencies to prepare cost-benefit analyses for review by OIRA. And during this regulatory analysis process, the agencies may or may not have any idea what's going on at OMB. This can be opaque not just to the public, but this can also be opaque to the agencies too, depending on, you know, the particular administration and who's running things. So this can be an issue for agencies who spend a year or 2 years or 3 years or more working on a proposal. They can't put that proposed rule into the Federal Register for review until after it's been vetted by OIRA. So that could mean that OIRA economists have looked at the cost-benefit analysis and they don't think the numbers work. You know, that could be why your regulation is being held up. It could be that, you know, the chief of staff has a problem with it. It could be coming from the White House, and you at the agency may or may not be looped into what's happening. So it sets up a hurdle right away that directs the agencies, before they can get to the next step, to really hone in on the economics of this. The cost-benefit analysis has to be there. And in addition, it's a place where politics can stop unpopular rules before they even get published in the Federal Register, before the public even knows what the content of the rule being reviewed is. So this is that place right here. So first thing that happens is the agency works up the rule, they send it to OIRA for OIRA review. Then, part of this review, and I call it a OIRA review and revision because that's really what happens, is that the agency makes changes as a result of this review process, right? So changes could be suggested by economists at OIRA, changes could be suggested by other agencies, or directly from another executive office of the president agency, or from the president's staff. So we don't know where the changes come from. We don't necessarily know what the changes are, but they occur before the rule gets published. Then if the agency's lucky, the rule gets published, there's public comment, and then even after that, it has to go through again another OIRA review, and this could be years, right? It could, you don't know, there's no, just because it went through in a month initially doesn't mean that it's not going to get tied up before the final rule comes out. There were reports of rules being held up pending the elections in the last election cycle. There have been lots of reports of politically unpopular rules in prior administrations being blocked because they were politically unpopular. And there are also examples of rules being blocked because in the eyes of the economists, in a sort of objective way, they really thought that the economics didn't work. So we don't know. We don't have a window into that process because it's not open to the public. Here are some concerns with cost-benefit analysis, which is what the social cost of carbon is being used in. It's not equipped to deal with complex socioeconomic systems. So initially, when cost-benefit analysis was being used by the Army Corps of Engineers to evaluate a dam project and figure out, are we going to recover, you know, the money that we're spending on this dam over a period of time? What discount rate should we use to take the value of the energy that's going to be generated and reduce it to present value? I mean, these things were being done for small projects. Now we're talking about things like, I mean, how do you take something like the Affordable Care Act that's going to have big macroeconomic impacts, it's going to reverberate throughout the entire economy, and figure out the costs and the benefits of any like discrete aspect of it? You can't, right? This type of microeconomics, in my view, is really poorly equipped to deal with things that are inherently macro, that are inherently effectuating large changes on the economy, on society. So that can be a problem when we come to talking about reforming our energy system, right? This tool, it doesn't look so good when we're looking at what the task is that we're going to use it for. In addition, it's essentially a normative exercise. If you look at a cost-benefit analysis textbook, it will tell you cost-benefit analysis is normative economics, right? This is not truly objective. It is filled with opinions, judgments, decisions, people using their best wisdom to take policy and incorporate that into the methodologies that are used. And because it's normative, it includes all these values, but because it creates objective-looking numbers, the normative judgments are buried. And so it creates what has a veneer of objectivity, but it's very dangerous because there are lots of values embedded in there. And so one of the values is that rights aren't very important, because these are not things that are easy to monetize. And another value is that a life is a life. And so it's not really possible for the agencies to easily distinguish between lives that are lost because somebody voluntarily undertook a risky activity and lives that are lost because somebody against their will and without their knowledge was exposed to toxins by a corporation that understood that what it's doing was risky. So these are different risks. We may have some willingness to accept some of these risks that are involuntarily incurred, but most people don't think that they have the same, avoiding them is equal, right? Most people would prefer to spend more, let the polluting firm, reduce its regulation more than they would want to prevent people from, say, skydiving, right? So this doesn't interact well with the way that we actually make decisions, the way that we actually prioritize in regulation. And it has all kinds of really difficult, tricky things that need to be sorted out. How much is a life worth? Is it worth $7 million? Is it worth $8 million? How do we figure that out? And the way that we've figured it out so far is that we've looked at the additional money that people have to be given before they will take on a risky job that's similar to the job that they have, but a little bit riskier. And you look at that incremental risk, and then from that you can extrapolate what value they put on their life. Makes sense, right? Except that when you actually apply the best techniques in real-world situations, you find that, for example, a study that was done on first-generation immigrants from Mexico who were lawfully in the United States working, their lives had a negative value. Their lives had no value at all. Under this theory, they would pay you to kill them. That's how low the value of their life was. So something about this theory is broken and not working. It assumes a type of well-functioning labor market and an amount of choice that doesn't actually exist in our society. But this is where our numbers are coming from. But the value we put on the lives isn't particularly low. So it could be $8 million in current dollars, say, right? So that seems like a lot. But if it turns out that that life is going to be saved 30 years from now, and if we apply the discount rates that are required to reduce that to present value, as if it were a sum of money that we're going to be received in the future, you find that it's just worth a tiny fraction of that. So even though we're using big numbers for our statistical lives, when it comes to regulations, like a lot of EPA regulations, and especially like climate regulations that are going to affect people way into the future, the value diminishes to almost nothing over time because of this discounting. So this is very controversial, and there's nothing objective about it, but it looks objective. It produces numbers that have the veneer of objectivity. So it's really controversial for this reason. So when it first undertook to regulate fuel economy standards, when it first undertook to do this, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration looked at emissions and said one benefit of making cars more fuel efficient is that it's going to have climate change impacts. But we don't know what they are. We can't monetize that. So what the agency did was it elected to use cost-benefit analysis to make the decision for it. So it didn't just do what it needed to do to get through the OIRA process, but it in addition used this as a basis for standard setting. It said we have room in the statute to interpret it that way. So that's what it did. It put no value on the carbon emissions that would be avoided, and petitioners objected. They said, environmental groups said, look, obviously this should have been included. This is a big benefit, and if you had, it would have made for more stringent standards. And the Ninth Circuit agreed. The Ninth Circuit said this rule is arbitrary and capricious because you didn't include CO2 emissions in your cost-benefit analysis. And this was radical. This was a really big change. This isn't something that agencies had been doing, monetizing the value of avoided greenhouse gas emissions. And suddenly the Ninth Circuit is saying that your rule is arbitrary and capricious if you don't do this. So then was convened a panel. An interagency working group from many agencies came together with some leadership from the Executive Office of the President, the OMB, and tried to pull together a social cost of carbon to be used in the cost-benefit analyses that were prepared for OMB. So this is this discrete task that was before this interagency working group. So this is what they undertook to do. in order to do this, they based their numbers on so-called integrated assessment models. So these are the foundation of the social cost of carbon. They used 3, and these estimate streams of damages over time to agricultural productivity, human health impacts, property damages from increased flood risk, ecosystem impacts. So first it has to figure out, in different parts of the earth, under different scenarios with different likelihoods, how much of these things will happen. So you can imagine that even using the best possible science, given the uncertainty, this is a very difficult task, right? So this is part 1. Part 2 is you have to make sure this is expressed in dollars. And so you have to figure out how to monetize these damages. So how much are human health impacts worth? The way these models tend to do it is they make the human health impacts a fraction of reduced GDP growth. So the value of a life is related to the GDP of the country where the person lives, under the theory that we should assess the value of people's lives in accordance with their willing to pay for incremental reductions in risk, right? So under this theory, it makes sense to value the lives of people in less affluent countries at a lower rate. So it makes sense if we're continuing to follow the logic that we've been using as we've used cost-benefit analysis over time. But people resist this, and I think rightfully so. People resist this as not okay because it implies that countries like the United States that have, we are the biggest contributor of carbon in the environment, even though we're not currently leading in emissions because China has surpassed us in the rate of emissions, because we've been polluting so much and for so long, and because it persists in the environment for hundreds of years, we are the biggest individual country contributor. So to say that our lives are worth more than the lives of people in Bangladesh who are going to be flooded out, as glaciers melt and land is lost, seems radically unjust. And yet, if you apply this economics rigidly, that's the result that you get. So it's really difficult and it's really controversial. And then once you've monetized those damages, those streams of damages over time, you have to figure out how to take the damages to the distant future and reduce their value to present value by some discount rate. And there's a huge amount of disagreement among economists because this is basically a philosophical argument, right? Should we imagine that when we don't invest in reducing greenhouse gas emissions that we would otherwise put that money in some, potentially better investment? Or, is that a realistic thing to assume? Or should we assume that that money would otherwise go somewhere else? So this is really controversial. There's no agreement here, but the United States had to come up with some kind of agreement for through this process. So the interagency working group came up with some numbers. Then the integrated assessment models were updated to reflect rising sea levels. So that was about all that changed. And then 3 years later, we got updated social cost of carbon numbers. So you can see that 2015, using the central estimate, $46 is the social cost of carbon. So that's the economic value of avoiding emitting a metric ton of carbon dioxide. So to give you a sense of how big that was, somebody calculated that out as about the size of 37 Toyota Camrys, to give you a sense of the volume of what that would be. So you can see the numbers here, and you see that they go up over time. Why is that? Well, the reason why the social cost of carbon is increasing is that marginally additional amounts of damage in the future are going to be more harmful when we're in more of a crisis state. So that's the theory underlying this increase. But really what happens, well, once we discount this, once we take this increased number and apply a discount rate to it, it isn't really worth more than current improvements. All right, some of the objections to the social cost of carbon estimates that the interagency working group has come up with. One is that the scope of it should be domestic instead of international. So right now, the damages, right, the damages avoided by reducing carbon emissions are global. They consider global impacts. Now, typically, a cost-benefit analysis would be United States costs and United States benefits, right? It would be confined to that. It's not typical for the United States to consider costs to the United States and compare it to benefits to the world. That's not normal behavior for these types of cost-benefit analysis. So some people have objected to this number as being way too big because it should, in order to be a cleaner analysis, we should only be looking at benefits to us, right? So I think that's wrong because this is a basis for policy making, and I think it's unjust for the United States to only look at impacts to the United States, because if you're, inflicting your carbon pollution on another unwilling country, I think you have the responsibility to not just balance your costs against your benefits, but to also look at the costs that you're inflicting on other countries. So, my opinion is that is correct, that we should, if we're going to undertake to do this, right, if we're going to use cost-benefit analysis to assess regulations, then if we're going to include the social cost of carbon, we ought to include global effects and not just domestic effects. Not that I think we should be using cost-benefit analysis, but given the reality that we're doing it. In addition, I think we should be increasing the value of statistical life for foreign lives, because right now we have, in a single cost-benefit analysis, we have certain direct health effects, right? We have certain direct health effects that are going to save lives in the United States domestically, and we'll use our big numbers, right? So we'll say our lives are worth the regular 8 million. And then we take these social cost of carbon numbers that use these integrated assessment models that value foreign lives at a lower number, and we don't adjust it up. We don't say, okay, well, we should assume that their life is as valuable as ours in this analysis. We should bring up that number out of fairness, out of equity, out of justice before we take an action domestically. We don't do that right now, and I think we ought to, because right now we're actually valuing foreign lives at a lower number than we're valuing domestic lives within the same cost-benefit analysis, and I think that's a justice problem. Another objection is that these are creating marginal rates, to get really technical. So this is supposed to be an additional unit of carbon dioxide plus or minus. What's its value? When you undertake to reduce carbon dioxide by a whole lot, then you are not effectuating a marginal change. You're effectuating a big change, right? And I talked about this at the beginning, but this is going to reverberate throughout the economy. This is going to have bigger impacts. And so some people have argued, some commentators say, well, because this isn't marginal, right? Because this isn't, you've created this marginal number for use in these analyses of regulations that create non-marginal impacts, bigger impacts, you're going to, the number should really be lower. Because what you're going to do is you're going to make it impossible to use coal in the United States. It's going to end up getting shipped to China, and they're not going to, burn it using the same standards that we have here. Better to let it be used here, right? So that's one argument, that the number should be lower. I would argue that, the number should be higher, because if you look at the United States international goals, if you look at what we would like to accomplish internationally, we're in a much better position to do that if we come in practicing what we preach, right? So we have now, as you may have seen, or you might see as you take a look at the President's climate agenda that was the handout, we have ambitious international goals to negotiate big changes with other countries. If we come in with dirty hands, right, very dirty hands, then it's going to be really difficult for us to have the platform to say, to do this, to be leaders on this. A good example of how this can work is the Montreal Protocol, where we banned the gases that were causing depletion of the ozone layer domestically in the United States before there was an international agreement. And people did say, this is going to just drive that production overseas. This is going to hurt us and not do anything to improve the environment. But actually it gave the United States the cachet to be able to go in on an international platform and negotiate for this and be a leader in this. And the Montreal Protocol has been really successful at preventing release of ozone-depleting chemicals. So, you know, you can argue it either way, but it simply isn't true that the marginal social cost of carbon is the right number for these regulations going to effectuate much larger non-marginal changes. And people are arguing about which direction it's wrong in, but you know, it does seem to be wrong because these are not marginal changes. All right, so Copenhagen 2009. So even though as I'm sure you're aware, we didn't sign on to the Kyoto Protocol, we didn't sign on to the second commitment period of that, obviously, but we did sign on to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So we are parties to an important international convention on climate change, and every year they meet and there's a conference of the parties. And in Copenhagen in 2009, we made this non-binding commitment: reduce emissions 17% from 2005 levels by 2020. So how are we going to get there? So this is the rate of emissions right now. You can see since 2005, it's already dipped. And a lot of this has been just natural market forces, right? It's mostly because of the transition to gas from coal. So that's most of this. But you do see that we're already starting to see a reduction since 2005. So we're part of the way to hitting that goal. Stranded carbon. So have some of you heard of the idea of a stranded investment? So the idea that you could have something valuable and then be unable to use it. Well, ExxonMobil is starting to consider the risk that in holding so much oil and gas, the risk that future regulation could cause it to lose value on its oil and gas holding. So you can see here that this shadow pricing that they're doing, they're estimating the value, the cost of carbon pollution, not because they, out of the goodness of their hearts, but because they see down the road the threat of regulation and they're concerned about the risk. So you see this acknowledgement of it. And other companies, for various reasons, have had to put a number on the value of carbon. A lot of it is just what we anticipate down the road. But if we're going to meet the goals that have been set at these various UN conventions to keep climate within 2 or 2.5 degrees centigrade from current temperatures, then a lot of coal, a lot of tar sands, a lot of oil is going to have to stay in the ground. And the holders of the dirtiest fuels, things like tar sands, things like coal, they know this, and they have a big economic incentive to get this out of the ground before the regulatory burden gets higher. And so, you know, you see this reflected in the behavior of the lobbying groups, and you know, it's worth it to spend a ton of money lobbying to get combustion of your fuel sooner rather than later if you think that 10 years from now the regulatory outlook for your fuel is terrible. All right, so some of the first steps that the White House has started to take have involved regulation of mobile sources of greenhouse gases. So passenger cars and light trucks is one, medium and heavy duty engines and vehicles is another. So we have mobile sources being regulated. You saw at the very beginning that was what started us with having a social cost of carbon, a federal social cost of carbon. And since that decision in 2007, these have been updated, and medium and heavy duty engines and vehicles are going to get updated again to become more strict than they are now. Stationary sources are being regulated by EPA in addition. Now, EPA had some choices here, right? Technically, under the statute, once the Massachusetts v. EPA decision came out and kind of gave the green light to EPA to regulate greenhouse gases as pollutants under the Clean Air Act, EPA had some choices. Now, it could have said that where they were going to treat it like something called a criteria pollutant, which you may have heard of. So they could have said that we're going to regulate under this standard for pollutants that are pervasive and cause health and environmental harms and have, many different sources. It did meet the technical requirements. They really could have regulated it as the so-called criteria pollutants. The problem with doing that may have seemed to be to EPA that it would just be impossible because the levels are supposed to be set at levels that are not harmful to human health. And figuring out a safe level of greenhouse gas emissions when we've already got enough persistent pollution in our environment to cause this phenomenon to occur and to cause loss of lives, even if we stop now. Well, to say what the safe level is, this would be setting us up, for an impossibility, right? So this would be creating targets that were impossible to hit. So, I can't read the agency's mind. I'm not sure that that's why they rejected this provision. But what they ended up deciding to do was regulate greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide specifically, under Section 111, which is less stringent. So I'm sure you've heard about the new source performance standards that are coming out for new power plants, right? So in addition to new source performance standards, right, that's the heading of Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. So it sounds like, okay, this applies to new sources, and you read a little further, and modified sources, that doesn't surprise you, right? That's sort of like a new source. But what about grandfathered sources? They're probably exempt, right? No, not for pollutants like carbon dioxide. If it's covered as a hazardous air pollutant, if it's regulated there, then no, existing sources are not going to be regulated under this section. If it's a criteria pollutant, right, which it isn't, then existing sources wouldn't be regulated under this section. But because it's in neither of those categories, existing sources under the new source provision can be regulated, are to be regulated. And so that's the process here. So we have existing sources that are set to be regulated under this provision, and also the new sources. And the standard here for new sources is the best system of emission reduction adequately demonstrated. So it needs to be already demonstrated. So it's not the best technology that we can imagine. It's not the best technology that we think in 5 years will be achievable. It's the best system of emission reduction adequately demonstrated. So that ratchets down the stringency from a place where EPA could just say, a strict whatever's safe, right? So I talked about that criteria pollutant standard that's based on strictly effects, is it safe enough? So this is looking at whether or not it's doable. So it's a little bit less aggressive, this approach. Best system of emission reduction adequately demonstrated, that's the standard. So for new power plants, I'm sure you saw initially the standards that were rolled out were the same for coal and for natural gas. And there was a great objection to that. And so the administration, the EPA issued new regulations. A proposal came out last fall, and it's set to be finalized any day. Although we're not there yet, but it's set to happen really soon. So we'll see if that actually comes to fruition. But coal emissions, that standard still couldn't be met without some kind of carbon sequestration, right? So, this industry has objected that this would be so expensive and difficult. It's not that carbon capture and sequestration, sorry about my abbreviation there, it's a little off. It's not that carbon capture and sequestration, they don't think that it's possible at all. It's just that they don't believe that they can economically achieve the emissions levels that are required under this standard, that are really similar to what's required for natural gas, but those are more doable. So this has been obviously upsetting for coal. So we're at that stage with that rule, where that rule has gone through years of process that we've seen, and this is subsequent to years of process that we didn't see. So how, in all that, how has this social cost of carbon number influenced rulemaking for these two sources, right? The first things that the administration tackled, right? So cars and power plants. Right? How has this impacted the regulatory process? Right? So we have, all this money being spent by trade associations and industry groups to oppose this number because it's so, dangerous to industry. So how has it impacted the cost-benefit analysis process? Well, for the mobile source regs, the number is really dwarfed by the value of the fuel savings. So the value to the consumer that goes into that analysis of the fuel savings just is so many times higher than the number that they ended up with for the social cost of carbon that it didn't really seem to make a huge impact on the stringency of the regulation. Now, maybe it did at the margins, move it a little bit one way or the other, but this wasn't, a gigantic move. What about for the proposed stationary source rule for new power plants? Right, this really controversial rule that industry says is going to make it impossible to build a new coal plant and have it be economically feasible, and that might be correct, right? Well, EPA projected that the proposed rule will result in negligible CO2 emission changes, quantified benefits and costs by 2022. So it doesn't matter. They're saying, what the EPA is saying here is that there is no big climatic impact to regulating the greenhouse gases here in this way, because this is what they would have done anyway, right? So you're locking industry into what you're expecting them to do, which is sort of less polluting than what's happened historically. But EPA's contention is, they would have done this. This is what we expect them to have done anyway. So we can't say, well, we've got some big, if not for this regulation, there's all this carbon dioxide pollution that would have occurred. So it's a really interesting result and sort of contrary to what you would have expected given the level of industry opposition to those numbers. All right. So coming soon, the EPA is working with states and power plants to kind of figure out what are we going to do about existing sources. This is going to be less strict, right? So this is not going to be as strict as the standards for new sources, but we don't know yet. We don't have a proposal, so we don't know what that's going to look like yet. But that's coming down the pike very soon. So that's on the docket for EPA. All right. So those are the examples of the social cost of carbon being used so far to effectuate the President's climate plan. These are the most direct applications because this is a number that was designed to be used in federal rulemakings when the analyses are prepared for OMB approval, right? But what about indirect applications, right? So economic support for renewables. Well, that is easier to justify if you have a higher social cost of carbon. So it could have an impact there. Now, to some extent, that's a rhetorical impact because it's not part of the legal process that's required, right? These sorts of things don't go through a wire review. But still, it's something that could end up in analyses that support those proposals. So it's likely to have an impact there. Investments in updating the grid, right? So, causing there to be less loss along power lines, making better capacitors so that we can have more integration of alternative energy on the grid. These are investments that are easier to justify if you have some numbers for what this will save, the efficiency created by these changes. If you can monetize it, then it may help to justify it. So it could have an impact there. We'll have to see. And promoting international agreements on climate. So you have to come home and you have to pitch something to your constituents. It's helpful to be able to say, it helps monetize social benefits of blank. People understand that. People understand, billions of dollars are a lot of money. So it could be helpful there, again, rhetorically. I think that this is what should be done as a matter of justice and fairness, and that we should, be looking at what we can do using, our best macroeconomic analysis and not this very flawed, broken microeconomic analysis. So I don't think this is the way that we should be making our decisions. But if this is the reality, if this is what we're using, then this social cost of carbon increase is a good thing. This recent update that increased it to incorporate sea level rise. And really, if we were going to better take into account justice concerns, we might want to think about bringing that number up, possibly quite a lot, as we make policy decisions. So with that, if you have questions, I know that was all very technical and it was a big blast of administrative law, but yes?
Sure. The standard for technology on coal-fired power plants, and I've already forgotten what it was, but how is that different from best available technology?
Best available technology doesn't incorporate that demonstrated requirement. In reality, though, they can be the same thing, right? It is a best available technology type standard, right? It's a technology-based standard, but it's a type that is less stringent than a technology-based standard that was just like, what can you get on the market? Because that might not really be demonstrated yet.
Okay.
So it's a little less, the language makes it a little less stringent than if it just said in the regulation best available technology. But you could call it a best available technology standard and not be wrong.
The second question is, it looks as if in the, back on your OIRA review,
Should I go back to that?
Yeah, and this is not, well, maybe it is, it's more of a political question, but how much influence does industry have, do we think, in that OIRA review? Because it looks as if that is a place at which the decision is made on which things are going to count in the cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah, so now that varies from administration to administration, from OIRA administrator to OIRA administrator. Under Reagan, there were people in OIRA who have written very explicitly, like, our job was to kill regulations. We were there to be anti-regulation, to put hard rules down in front of them. And so it's very explicit that this was intentional. We're trying to be a roadblock. And the rationale for that, why are you in there trying to kill the regulations that your own executive branch is creating? This is madness. Well, the idea was that these agencies were so power hungry that they were going to just regulate us into the ground, and so there needed to be this institutional, structural opposition to that. So that was the idea under, certainly under at least part of the Reagan administration, if not the whole thing. Sometimes, you could have lobbying that goes directly to the president. Somebody in the president's office comes and talks to OIRA, says we need to put this on hold. So this may have happened to the ozone rule. Ozone is one of the criteria pollutants, and it was due for an updated standard, and that was held. And there were reports that this came, from the White House and was a result of, if not direct lobbying pressure, then, sort of seeing the political writing on the wall. So it was a political decision and not a decision on the merits of that regulation, and that they came from the White House. So, yes, it can be really political. It can also be, I think that there are a lot of earnest people in OIRA who think that what they're doing is really good, promoting good public policy and making sure that regulations don't come out too quickly and without enough analysis. I don't think the office is doing a good job. If you look at the backlog and if you look at the number of regulations that have just been, pending for, a year sometimes, or even 2 years, or one was up there for 3 years that I saw recently, it doesn't seem to be functioning very well to me. But anyway, yeah, the answer is that it is sometimes a political office, and sometimes it has intentions that are not political, that are, purely, the agency functioning the way it, theoretically is supposed to. But even there, I think it's pretty broken because it's so understaffed and because its mission is mistaken.
I guess I was less top-down political pressure, but more of the just at the working level. I know industry often has close relationships with regulators and has a lot of input into the development of rules down at the desk level, if you will, at the working desk level. And I just wondered if that is one of the things that goes on over there, and I don't know, maybe that's something that no one knows exactly.
The regulated industry can meet with the OIRA desk officers, they can meet with the OIRA administrator, they have these meetings, and it's supposed to be docketed and it's supposed to be available to the public. But then if you go and you look at the records, you see these big giant gaps. So it seems very unlikely, that nobody came and lobbied OIRA on certain of these topics for this long period of time. But if you look at the records, there are all these gaps. So the public is supposed to have the information, if not about what happened at meetings with outside industry, at least that the meetings occurred, but it doesn't seem that the public is getting that information. However, if the lobbying goes through another executive office of the president's office, or if it comes directly through the White House, then there may be no record of it. So that may be a way that it can be completely invisible. So it can be, during the OIRA review process, blocked through lobbying that's invisible to us. But yeah, those meetings do occur. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure. Other questions? I know this was pretty technical and kind of a, yeah.
You have the one slide with one of the, I think, possible alternative analyses, including property damage, flooding. And I was just curious if that was, if that is a truncated version of all the property damage they considered, or if it was really strictly limited to just flooding, because I know that we have a lot of concerns even here in Oklahoma about whether earthquakes or, groundwater pollution, and there are a lot of other kinds of property damage that I could see having some cost impact on this analysis.
So it's incomplete. The integrated assessment models that are really the foundation for the social cost of carbon, they consider some, direct, and they're varied. There are three that are used, and they don't each consider the same scenarios. But flooding and property damage, the numbers are estimates. So they do consider property damage beyond the immediate property damage caused by flooding. Increased intensity of storms, for example, that would, be non-flooding, damages. So, it does go beyond that, but it really varies from model to model what's considered. Yes?
How deep does the cost-benefit analysis go? At what point do they decide that there is so much cost and so little benefit? It hasn't happened yet, but what about a Katrina, Sandy? At what point are they going to say, pull the plug? It seems like it almost happened at Katrina, but how deep does this cost-benefit analysis go?
Well, there are whole countries, that could be underwater, that have their entire populations displaced. There are hugely problematic events that could occur there, like a huge threat of a large number of, what people are, say, calling climate refugees, but people that lose their land and then have to come into another country, and that could potentially be, a national security issue for some countries, for many countries. So, yeah, this is a huge threat, and there are, really big risks, and we are not doing a good job managing them using this tool, because this tool isn't up for the job. And so, if this is justifying, some action that we needed to take anyway, then it's good to the extent it's justifying that action. But this isn't a coherent, internally consistent, good way to set policy to use the social cost of carbon. These cost-benefit analyses, they don't just have, carbon. They don't just have this SCC number. They've got lots of other inputs, and a lot of those are really contestable. If you would really look at one of these, you would say, well, this is really incomplete, or this is...
But like the cost of the British Virgin Islands being flooded out as opposed to Haiti, where the people are valued at less, I would assume, because of the poverty and third world being valued. You said people were valued differently in different
the
places.
models look at, the damages are percent of lost GDP growth And so, yeah, if your GDP is lower, then your value is lower. And they look at, regions. And so, it would be, but yeah, I mean, it's all, the models are thick and difficult to understand. It's not that they're intentionally opaque. I mean, a lot of this information, if you wanted to pick it apart, is pretty available. But, this is really hard to do. And so industry, no matter, even though a lot of this information is provided, the underlying information that goes into the models, and so you could, sort of get into the, the weeds more and really get into the details of it, that's incredibly difficult for even a team of people, to really do and, tear it apart and look at all of the different assumptions and all of the, so, okay, that study's 5 years old, we know that it's out of date, what's our best guess at, the ways, so this is, there's so much that goes into them. They're so complicated. So they can be opaque even without intending to be opaque.
Well, Melissa, thank you very much for making a complicated subject very accessible. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, there's that. Record, whatever you need to get it up to equal the cost of the dam. That's how much the recreational benefit was.
A number with the benefits of different credits and
Okay, thanks.
Yeah,
Thank you.
exactly. We'll be here.
It's good to see you.
Hey, you're welcome. Thank you very much for your visit.
Well, enjoyed it much.
Thanks.
Enjoyed the program.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for coming. Great to see you. Good to see you.